An elderly couple bought an abandoned storage unit, but what they found inside the old safe shocked them. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories about incredible discoveries, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. For most of their adult lives, Ruth and George Adams had learned to live with a kind of quiet caution, the sort that settles into a household like a faint draft that never completely disappears. Their home, a small single-story house on a quiet street in a working-class neighborhood, had a foundation of real love and slow-earned resilience, but its walls carried the marks of years where every decision had a price. The paint on the wooden siding was chipped in long, curling flakes, and the front step creaked each time one of them put weight on it, as if announcing the arrival of familiar feet. Inside, everything was meticulously clean, yet undeniably old. The leather on the couch had stretched into soft wrinkles, the cushions long past their firmness. A fan, positioned on a side table in the living room, rotated with a slight wobble as it hummed through warm afternoons when they hesitated to turn on the air conditioning because the electric bill came too quickly each month and always brought unwelcome reminders of limited means. The kitchen, narrow and bathed in light from a small window above the sink, was where Ruth spent most of her time. She had an instinctive talent for stretching groceries further than anyone expected could be done. A few vegetables, a chicken bought on sale, and leftovers that were never thrown away but always reinvented became meals that tasted far richer than the ingredients suggested. The old stove sometimes coughed when ignited, and the refrigerator ran with a low growl that grew louder at night, but both kept serving, as though loyal to the couple who had relied on them for decades. Ruth used to joke that her home was held together by prayer, duct tape, and the sheer stubbornness of people who refused to give up. George always smiled at that, though deep down he knew it was more true than either of them liked to admit. He had once been strong enough to repair anything: engines, appliances, bicycles, doors that jammed or windows that stuck. Hands that had lifted engines from truck chassis and tightened bolts blindfolded now trembled slightly if he worked too long with a tool. Aging had pressed its thumb on his knuckles and spine, shaping aches into daily companions he could neither fix nor ignore. They had spent decades in steady work. Ruth had spent her life caring for others, working as a nursing assistant first in a clinic, then helping elderly patients in their homes. She knew how to comfort those in pain, how to clean wounds gently, how to talk softly with people whose last years were full of confusion or loneliness. George, meanwhile, had lived in garages where the smell of oil and gasoline seeped into his skin and clung even after scrubbing. He had fixed rusted-out sedans and gleaming sports cars with equal care, hands moving with familiar precision. But physical labor takes its toll, and when his back finally gave out from years of lifting what no man his age should lift, the doctor told him bluntly it was time to stop. They hadn't been ready for the end of full-time work. The transition into retirement would have been easier if their savings were intact, but they'd fallen prey to a fraudulent pension investment plan years earlier, a scheme that promised security and instead stole the cushion they worked a lifetime to build. They had sued, along with dozens of others, but the company had vanished overnight, leaving nothing but hollow apologies from officials who shrugged and called it an unfortunate situation. The Adamses received no compensation, only the sharp, lingering humiliation of being taken advantage of, a feeling that often returns to those who have spent their lives trusting quietly in the good of others. Money, once a stable foundation, had become a fragile balancing act. Every month required careful planning. Ruth kept a notebook where she logged every expense in neat handwriting: water bill, electricity, groceries, medication, property tax. Her list was a daily reminder that even small indulgences could cause the structure of their finances to wobble. There were no dinners out, no visits to the movies, no trips beyond Sunday drives and free community events. Even birthdays and holidays were measured affairs. Gift cards with modest amounts, homemade pies instead of expensive meals, embraces and smiles that carried unspoken apologies for what they couldn't afford to give. Despite the limitations, the Adamses were not unhappy. They loved each other in that deep, resilient way that grows over years of teamwork, compromise, and weathered storms. They found joy in sitting together on their porch swing when their bones allowed it, watching neighborhood kids race bicycles down the sidewalk. They laughed at old jokes they both knew by heart, jokes softened by repetition but still comforting like a favorite blanket. Ruth found pride in tending to her small garden of flowers, coaxing life from the soil beside the porch, and George tried to stay useful by performing small repairs around the neighborhood for friends and neighbors, often refusing payment or accepting only a slice of pie in return. What weighed heaviest on them was not the reduction of comforts, but the shrinking horizon of possibility. They still dreamed sometimes of visiting the ocean they'd seen only in postcards, of surprising their grandchildren with something truly special, of relaxing without calculating costs in their minds. But each year the dreams receded a little further, dimming like a distant lighthouse swallowed by fog. George, sitting alone at the kitchen table on a warm afternoon, found himself flipping the pages of a newspaper that grew thinner with each passing year. He noticed hardly anything new in its stories. Politicians promising improvements that would never reach people like him, advertisements showing products he could not afford, sports scores that meant little now that stadium seats were out of reach. He set the paper aside and found his gaze drawn instead to his hands. They were larger than he remembered, thickened at the joints, skin mapped with veins, scars from tools slipping, knuckles swollen with age. These were hands that once solved problems, hands that held purpose. He wondered when they had become hands that mostly folded in his lap, waiting for something to do. Later that week, he walked to the nearby hardware store to pick up a small bag of screws for a loose cabinet door Ruth had asked him to tighten. The building smelled of wood and metal and possibility, a place where he remembered being in his element. As he made his way to the register, he passed two younger men talking excitedly near the tool aisle. Their voices dropped to a conspiratorial murmur, but one phrase reached him clearly: storage auctions. George paused to examine a shelf of hinges, pretending to compare sizes while his ears sharpened. He heard the men trading stories, people discovering antiques worth thousands, or sealed boxes filled with valuable collections, or even envelopes of cash hidden in drawers. One mentioned a whole safe full of silver coins found by someone in a neighboring town. The more they talked, the more George felt a faint flicker of anticipation in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Opportunity, tiny, improbable, and yet real, stirred inside him. On the walk home, George wrestled with that feeling. Logic told him it was fantasy, a distraction at best. The sensible thing was to ignore it and focus on what they had: a roof over their heads, food on the table, each other's company. But imagination kept returning to the idea. Storage units abandoned by owners who disappeared or gave up, locked spaces that might hide history, stories, value, something forgotten but waiting. That evening, during dinner, he mentioned the conversation to Ruth. He tried not to sound too invested, presented it as a curious anecdote. Ruth listened, nodding thoughtfully as she sipped her tea. She knew her husband well enough to recognize when an idea had lodged itself into his mind. She reminded him gently that they didn't have money to gamble. There were bills coming up soon, and the car needed new tires before winter. George nodded agreement, but the spark didn't die. Hours later, after Ruth had dozed off in her recliner with the television casting shifting shadows across the room, George found himself drawn to the outdated laptop their grandson had helped set up months earlier. The screen flickered awake, and with fingers stiff from disuse, he slowly typed a search phrase. Storage auctions near me. What opened in front of him felt like a hidden district of the world that had been operating just out of sight. Lists of upcoming auctions appeared, many of them online. Grainy photographs displayed cluttered units behind metal roll-up doors, piles of clothing, broken appliances, dusty furniture stacked precariously, bicycles missing wheels. Most looked like dumping grounds, repositories of misfortune and neglect, but George kept scrolling. Then he saw an image that made him stop breathing for a moment. In a small thumbnail, the right corner of a unit was dominated by a large, rectangular shape draped under a heavy tarp. The lines visible beneath hinted at something massive and industrial. He clicked the picture to enlarge it, though the quality improved only slightly. Still, he could see enough. The bottom edge revealed steel plates painted a faded, deep green color. Decorative, brass-styled hinges protruded slightly, and just beneath the tarp's edge, a small metallic plate bore an embossed insignia that George, through the haze of time, instinctively recognized as the mark of a manufacturer who once built bank vaults and high-security safes. His heart began to beat faster. A safe like that was not something people lugged into a storage facility without purpose. It would require expensive equipment to move. It would not be abandoned casually. Someone had paid to keep it hidden for a reason, and someone had stopped paying just long enough for it to enter the realm of public auction. George stared at the price listed beneath the photo. $1,000 as a starting bid, more than they could spare, yet somehow not impossible. He printed the listing quietly and hid the paper under a magazine before going to bed. Sleep, when it arrived, came slowly and broke easily. The next morning, George placed the printed listing gently in front of Ruth at the kitchen table. He spoke plainly, explaining what he saw, why it felt different from the usual junk. Ruth took her time examining the grainy image. Her brow furrowed while she considered it, and she looked at George with concern before she looked again at the picture. She wasn't impulsive. Her entire life had been constructed around careful planning, protecting them both from mistakes that couldn't be undone. But she also loved George, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen for a long time. An eagerness, a quiet fire that reminded her of the man she married decades ago, the man who once believed the world held surprises meant especially for them. Ruth folded the paper slowly and placed it back in his hands. They would not tell themselves comforting lies about what this could be. They might lose money they desperately needed. They might discover nothing but disappointment. But they had spent a lifetime being cautious, and still ended up on the edge of not enough. Perhaps, for once, they needed to be cautious in a different way. 2 days later, the online auction began just before noon. George and Ruth sat side by side, eyes fixed on the countdown clock. At first, several bids appeared, but they dropped out just as quickly, leaving 2 competitors who inched the number upward. The username with the other highest bid had no profile picture and no history, like a blank mask. Then, unexpectedly, that bidder vanished from the list entirely in the final minute. George felt a rush of confusion that quickly turned into determination. 3 seconds left on the timer. He clicked the bid button. The countdown froze. A message appeared at the top of the screen confirming the winning bid. They were now the owners of whatever lay behind the metal door of that mysterious storage unit. They didn't cheer. They didn't leap from their chairs. They simply looked at each other, fully aware that their lives had just shifted course. Whether toward danger or deliverance, neither of them knew. The metal roll-up door of their future now waited 2 towns away. What they had purchased was not simply a forgotten box of junk, but a question, a sealed possibility heavy enough to pull them away from the life they knew and into a story that would demand courage they weren't entirely sure they had left. Tomorrow they would face that door. The next morning came with a restless kind of anticipation, the sort that fills the chest with both dread and hope, as though the heart cannot quite decide which feeling to obey. Ruth and George woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had risen high enough to warm their back porch or melt the thin layer of dew on the grass. They moved about the kitchen in quiet rhythm, fixing breakfast they barely tasted. Even the clatter of dishes felt louder than usual, as if the house were holding its breath with them. George double-checked the printed auction receipt, making sure the address and unit number were correct. Ruth brought along a flashlight, a notebook, gloves, and 2 bottles of water, her years of careful preparation refusing to yield even to excitement. When they finally stepped out into the morning air and climbed into their aging sedan, the decision they'd made 2 days earlier felt heavier than it had behind a computer screen. Money had left their account. They owned something now, something they couldn't yet see clearly, something that carried both promise and danger wrapped in a shadow. The storage facility sat well beyond the edges of their familiar world. Past the grocery store where Ruth always checked coupon deals, past the neighborhood where their church community lived, past rows of small houses like their own. Here, the land opened into flat industrial territory forgotten by beauty and watched only by infrastructure and weeds. The building itself was a long spine of metal units, each sealed by its own corrugated steel door, each containing secrets left behind by people whose lives had shifted or unraveled. When they walked inside the small office, the air smelled faintly of dust and toner ink. The young man at the counter greeted them with a polite nod, then asked for their paperwork. His hands froze for a second when he spotted the number printed on the page. His eyes flickered with something that wasn't quite fear, but was too cautious to be simple curiosity. "So, you're the ones who won 23B," he said, taking just a moment too long to let out his breath. He pointed towards the most distant stretch of units, his tone returning to forced professionalism. "It's down there, last door on the right. I'll walk with you to get it unlocked." Ruth and George exchanged a quick glance. They had both noticed the hesitation. The young man locked up the office and walked them down the long aisle of metal doors, gravel crunching underfoot. He did not speak for several steps, as though he were weighing something in his mind. Finally, he cleared his throat. The person who rented this unit, he was a little unusual, he said, keeping his focus ahead. Paid on time every month, in cash, never spoke much. Always came late in the day. Somehow he always seemed to know when we were getting close to closing. Never gave a name. Not one we could verify anyway. George listened carefully. Ruth felt her fingers tighten slightly around the strap of her purse. "There were rumors," the employee continued quietly, lowering his voice. "People said they heard noises from inside. Big metal shifts, like heavy bolts or machinery. Stuff that shouldn't be happening in a storage unit." He paused again, eyes moving down the row. "We figured he had some kind of workshop in there, maybe tools or equipment he didn't want to keep at home. But the way he acted, it was strange. He reached the final door and stopped. The blue paint was chipped, rust creeping along the bottom edge. A padlock, currently in their possession according to the auction, had already been cut off by the facility's crew before bidding began, but the sliding latch was still locked shut through the built-in mechanism. The employee unlatched it with a sharp click. "You sure you don't need help with anything?" he asked, his eyes lingering on the door a second longer than normal. "We'll manage," George replied, though he wasn't entirely certain. The young man nodded slowly, turned back toward the office, and walked away just a bit too quickly. Left alone in the silence, Ruth and George stood before the sealed space that now belonged to them. George felt his pulse in his hands. Ruth's breath entered and left her chest in measured pacing. Together, they grasped the handle and began to roll the door upward. The first sound was the scrape of metal sliding along its track, followed by a low groan as years of dust and resistance gave way. Light crept inward, revealing the shape they already knew would be there. The tarp-covered form dominated the back of the unit like a monolith, draped in an attempt at concealment that only emphasized its immensity. The safe seemed almost alive beneath its cloak, as if the rounded curve of the dial and the squared shoulders of the steel body waited patiently for acknowledgement. Dust floated through the air in the small spirals as Ruth stepped forward across the concrete floor. The space smelled of old air, the stale mixture of cardboard, metal, and something else, something colder, deeper, like secrecy made tangible. Before confronting the looming presence, they scanned the rest of the unit. There was surprisingly little clutter. A folding cot leaned against the left wall, a thin blanket rolled at one end as though recently used. Nearby stood a small metal desk with one drawer slightly ajar, a mug, washed but stained, sitting empty on its surface. The setup was not that of someone storing worthless belongings. It looked like a temporary refuge, a place someone returned to more than occasionally. Ruth knelt near a stack of plastic containers. She opened one and found neatly organized supplies: canned soups, bottled water, sealed packets of instant meals. Everything was arranged with meticulous precision, labels facing outward, expiration dates written clearly on the lids in black marker. Not the hoarding of a careless mind, but the preparation of someone who cared about every detail. George approached the tarp with a sense of reverence and dread. He reached out and touched the dusty fabric. The coldness of metal lurked underneath, as if the safe were absorbing the chill of the dark concrete environment and returning it through its skin. He pulled back the tarp. It resisted slightly, snagging on corners, but then slid aside to reveal the true shape beneath. A vault safe, the kind designed not for bedrooms or business offices, but for bank floors and heavily guarded rooms. The green surface was faded and worn, but still proud. Gold pinstripe and traced edges of the door, and the insignia he had glimpsed in the photograph shone faintly, an old manufacturer renowned for their impenetrable engineering. George's breath caught. This was no forgotten scrap of metal. Someone had paid to move this here, someone with both money and secrecy in mind. Ruth stood beside him, eyes wide but steady. She could feel the significance of it, the weight not only of steel, but of whatever history was locked inside. George stepped closer, examining the dial. His fingers hovered just above its surface, careful not to disturb anything yet. He felt the memory of past experience rise within him, those years in the garage when a stiff lock or stubborn car safe had depended on skillful hands. He once knew how to handle mechanisms like this. The memory came back like muscle memory waking from a long sleep. The rest of the unit called for attention too, so they spent time inspecting every corner. Ruth opened the desk drawer and found a thin stack of receipts, each one from local shops, always paid in cash. There were notebooks filled with cryptic notes, initials, numbers, short lines of text like code meant only for the writer. No addresses, no personal photos, no identifiers. Whoever this was, Ruth thought silently, he didn't want to be found. On the back wall, small red marks were drawn in a vertical line, dates, perhaps, corresponding to visits. Some recent, some from months ago. The knowledge that someone had once stood here regularly sent a shiver through her. By the time they stepped back outside the storage unit into the afternoon light, the stillness inside had imprinted itself on them, spreading through their minds like a slow creeping realization. Their quiet lives suddenly felt precarious, balanced atop a secret that wasn't theirs, but now belonged wholly to them. They closed the roll-up door carefully and secured the new lock. The safe would remain untouched until they figured out how to proceed. There was excitement, yes, but more than excitement, an unease that tightened around each decision like a thin wire. The drive home was quiet. Ruth stared out the window at a world that looked unchanged but no longer felt familiar. George focused on the road, though his mind spun through possibilities. He felt the urge to return immediately with tools and his aging knowledge of metalwork to test the lock and coax it into revealing its secrets. But he also remembered every caution Ruth had ever spoken aloud, and every fear she had tried to bury deep when money ran thin. That night, as they sat at their kitchen table, they discussed the safest way to move forward. They agreed to take what they had learned seriously. They would not rush. They would prepare. They would think like people who knew danger might be wrapped inside opportunity. Long after they turned out the lights and tried to sleep, George lay awake, replaying the day in his mind. He could still see the faint gleam of brass on the safe's dial and hear the slight tremor in the employee's voice when he recognized the number 23B. The safe waited for them. It waited in the dark behind a locked metal door 2 towns away, steady and unmoving as time itself. And with every hour that passed, the distance between George's quiet past and the uncertain weight of whatever future awaited them seemed to shrink. Tomorrow they would return. And tomorrow, the real test of their resolve would begin. When morning arrived once again, the Adams home stirred before dawn, as though the walls themselves understood that this day demanded something different from all the days that had come before. George rose slowly, not because he wanted to take his time, but because his back reminded him that the body ages even when the spirit tries to reclaim youth. Ruth already stood in the kitchen, moving with her familiar quiet efficiency as she packed a thermos of steaming coffee, a few simple sandwiches wrapped neatly in wax paper, and a folded blanket she insisted they bring in case he needed something soft to kneel on. The storage unit and the massive safe inside it had occupied the space in both of their minds overnight, a restless presence that refused to let sleep settle long enough to offer rest. They drove to the storage facility in the pale light of a day just beginning, the sun still nudging its way over the horizon. The air outside carried the crisp hint of morning, cool enough to feel sharp with possibility. When they arrived, the lot was nearly empty. The office door remained locked. They were early enough to ensure privacy, intentional or otherwise. George unlocked the door to their unit with slightly trembling hands, some mixture of adrenaline, anticipation, fear, and the weight of everything that had led them here. The roll-up door clattered upward, echoing along the corridor. The air inside remained stale and cold, untouched by sunlight. The safe waited, motionless and imposing, like a monument erected to honor secrecy itself. Ruth set the thermos down beside the cot and brought over the blanket. George kneeled carefully, his joints already voicing their complaints. He took a slow breath as he placed one hand on the dial of the safe, pressing his palm against the metal as though greeting an old acquaintance. In a way, he was. The sensation of touching a mechanical lock stirred muscle memory he hadn't used in years. Once, he had been able to read these small hums and clicks like a language only few understood. His fingers twitched slightly, eager to rediscover the communication between ear, hand, and hidden mechanics. But this safe was far more sophisticated than the small cash safes he'd dealt with at the garage. Inside, heavy components lay waiting. Multiple wheels, bolts thick as a man's wrist, a door reinforced to withstand fire, cutting equipment, and determination. He turned the dial slowly, the metal sliding beneath his fingertips in smooth resistance. The faint click that followed each number was like the ticking of a heavy clock buried deep behind the steel face. His ear pressed near the door, he listened for the subtle shift within, the microscopic drops and caches that signaled wheels aligning and tumblers settling. Ruth watched from a few steps away, arms folded gently as she tried not to hold her breath. She knew that if she spoke too soon, she risked disrupting the concentration drawn tight around her husband. Even the soft scrape of her shoe on concrete seemed loud in her ears. Hours slipped by in silence. The safe allowed nothing yet, its secrets guarded behind a mechanism aged but not weakened. George noted combinations on a scrap of paper, testing his theories and ruling out patterns as he listened for changes that never came. Frustration tugged at him, though he swallowed it each time it rose. This was work he once knew well, and he refused to let years away from it turn him into a man defeated by steel. The safe door glinted where the tarp had been removed, a dim green that seemed almost indifferent to the effort before it. George spun the dial again, slower this time, sensing but not yet hearing something new. Twice he paused, believing he felt the gentlest shift inside. Twice he was disappointed when the handle stubbornly refused to move. Ruth stepped forward with the thermos and urged him to take a break. She placed a hand on his shoulder, warm and steady, reminding him that he didn't have to prove anything in one morning. He nodded reluctantly, allowing himself a moment to relax his cramping fingers and sip the coffee she poured. It was bitter and strong, and in that moment, tasted like determination. They stepped outside the unit to breathe fresh air beneath a sky that had fully brightened into midday. A few other tenants had arrived now, unlocking or closing their own units, going about errands and chores that felt far easier than the task that awaited inside number 23. B. George rubbed his left hand, flexing the fingers slowly. He worried quietly that if he failed, they would have lost money they truly needed. Yet, something deeper than pride told him he was close. Though his ears had grown rusty with age, the mechanism within the safe spoke faintly to him with the old language he used to understand. After finishing their sandwiches in the quiet of their car, they returned inside. Ruth resumed her soft search of the space, motivated less by curiosity now, and more by the hope of clues hidden in plain sight. Her eyes caught the serial number engraved near the base of the safe, partly obscured by a smear of dust. It was long, digits and letters, but the sequence struck her as too specific to be random. She called George softly and pointed. He wiped the area clean with a rag from his pocket. As he studied the number, he murmured to himself, connecting pieces. Some manufacturers, he remembered, used parts of serial numbers as base references for default combinations or modifications adjusted over time. And people, especially people who dealt with secrets, often hid significant numbers in plain sight, trusting that only those who looked carefully would understand their meaning. He jotted down portions of the serial number alongside the dates Ruth had found, scrawled on a corner of the desk. One date repeated itself, month and day, perhaps a birthday or another important marker. He combined those values into a sequence and returned to the safe, placing himself once again in front of the cold steel barrier. This time he approached with renewed calm. He turned the dial with the patience of a man who understood that precision could not be rushed. One full turn left, a slow return past 0, a delicate easing into the next number. The safe responded faintly, a soft internal catch that brushed against his fingertips like the whisper of hope. He continued, hands steady, breath measured. When he reached the final number, he released the dial gently, as though letting go of something fragile. Then his hand closed around the heavy handle. It felt immovable at first. He leaned his weight into it slowly, waiting for resistance to yield if it were ready to give way. Then it happened. A simple, deep click, quiet enough that Ruth barely heard it, yet unmistakable. The handle shifted. The sound resonated through George's bones, a sound that promised secrets coming undone. The seal of the door, long pressed shut by pressure and time, broke with a soft sigh. For a moment, they both froze. The importance of the instant held them still, suspended in silence, as if even dust dared not move. George pulled the door open further, inch by inch, until the gap widened enough to see into the darkness inside. Ruth stepped closer, her hand finding his, the two of them united in a mixture of awe and apprehension. The interior of the safe remained in shadow, deep and impenetrable from the doorway. Still, they could already make out shapes, stacks of rectangular forms, tidy and neatly aligned on shelves, something metallic reflecting a glint of outside light, folders lined upright like soldiers standing at attention, and near the back, a solid, box-shaped object separate from the rest. The air that escaped from the safe smelled of stored time, paper, old bills, perhaps a trace of oil. It didn't smell like abandonment. It smelled like purpose. They didn't touch anything yet, not in that first breath of discovery. Instead, they simply looked, knowing that whatever lay inside had the power not only to change their circumstances, but to rewrite the course of their future. Ruth exhaled first, slowly, as though releasing the tight knot that had gripped her chest since the auction. The fear was still there, but now it mixed with something brighter, a spark, an awakening, a belief that maybe, just maybe, life had not finished offering the unexpected. George placed his other hand on the cool steel and nodded as the weight of the moment settled. They had done it. On skill, hope, and stubborn persistence alone, they had opened a door that someone else had once paid dearly to lock. What remained unknown was whether the door they had just unsealed was meant to stay closed. But that question belonged to tomorrow. For now, they stood together before the opening of a story larger than either of them could yet imagine. A story whose first secret had just slipped into the light. The moment the safe opened fully, the stale air inside breathed outward like an exhalation long held back. It drifted around Ruth and George in a faint current that smelled of old paper, metal dust, and something else they couldn't immediately name. Something faintly medicinal, like a hospital corridor. The door creaked as it swung wider, not in protest, but in the grudging surrender of a thing that had resisted for too long, Inside, the shadows clung to the shelves with a density that hinted at years without light. Even as the afternoon brightness seeped in through the open storage unit, the interior seemed determined to remain dim, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets too quickly. For a brief time, neither of them moved. They stood shoulder to shoulder, connected not only by their clasped hands, but also by the silent understanding that this was a turning point, one neither of them could have imagined a month ago, or even a week ago. The safe was not empty. That much was undeniable even from the threshold. The shapes inside were too intentional, too neatly positioned, too carefully aligned. Someone had arranged these things with purpose, not carelessness, and the weight of that realization pressed on them both. George took the first careful step forward. His knee complained as he bent closer to the lower shelf, and Ruth instinctively placed a steadying hand between his shoulder blades. He lifted a small stack of bundled cash with reverence, as though afraid that touching it too firmly might cause it to crumble into dust. The rubber bands around the bundles were brittle and browned, evidence of time and temperature shifts inside the metal vault. When he turned one bundle slightly, the edges of the bills whispered against his fingertips. Hundreds, all of them. Dozens of stacks arranged in two neat rows, the paper worn but intact, the ink faded only slightly. Not enough to be old enough to lose value, yet old enough that the money had been hidden away for years. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. Money like this didn't just disappear into a storage unit unless it was meant to be concealed. She could already feel the temptation tug at her, the promise of solved problems, of new opportunities, of a future no longer suffocated by scarcity. She forced her gaze away and instead focused on the upper shelf where a series of brown folders sat lined up in chilling precision. Their tabs bore typed labels, but the words were short and sparse, initials, dates, reference numbers that meant nothing to her yet spoke volumes of official business. They were the sort of labels used by institutions that rarely shared their contents willingly. She reached out and gently lifted the first folder. Inside were pages of photocopied documents, some stamped with seals of agencies she recognized from years of watching the news, others marked only by black bars of redaction that cut through sentences like scars. Dates spanned several years, perhaps a decade. There were receipts of evidence transfers, case numbers paired with codes that meant nothing in this small, dusty unit, but had once meant everything to someone who feared exposure. On several pages, someone had circled names, officers, detectives, administrators, and written amounts beside them. The amounts were larger than any paycheck Ruth had ever seen. George, noticing her stiff posture, looked up from the cash he was inspecting. He reached to take another folder and found more of the same. Careful documentation of transactions that fed some unspoken network of corruption. Bribes, payoffs, seized assets that never made it into official reports. There were signatures, barely legible scrawls that seemed to shrink from the responsibility of what they represented, as though even the pen had hesitated under the weight of what it recorded. But it was the small black phone, sitting alone near the deepest corner of the safe, that pulled George's gaze next. Its surface was scratched, its buttons old-fashioned, the type used before data and touchscreen convenience took over the world. Its battery cover had a crack running diagonally across the back. A faint adhesive residue showed where tape may once have held it together. He lifted it gently and turned it over in his hands. It was off, mercifully silent, inert. Yet, even without powering it on, the phone seemed to hum with significance. It did not belong among forgotten clutter. It belonged to a person with something to hide, perhaps something to confess or record. He set it down carefully on the moving blanket they had placed on the ground. Ruth continued to sift through folders, her movements slow, as though each page she turned carried the weight of a stone. She found a thick ledger bound in worn leather and filled with rows of numbers that read like the trail of a secret economy. Each line was meticulously documented, with terse notes written in a tight, controlled script. The handwriting was confident, even when dealing with matters that should have unnerved the writer. There were references to amounts received, held, and disbursed, alongside cryptic words like drop, reserve, and insurance. The deeper they looked, the clearer the picture became. Whoever the previous renter of this unit had been, he was no simple criminal hiding an illegal stash. He was either a man ensnared in the dark underbelly of his department or deliberately operating within it. One folder contained photocopies of internal investigation reports, some with names Ruth recognized from local scandals or newspaper articles. Certain documents bore the marks of unfinished cases, testimonies that had led nowhere, witness statements that had evaporated, threads of corruption that had gone cold. Ruth's fingers brushed over a page clipped with a small note. The message was typed in rigid block letters. Stay quiet until instructed. Do not contact anyone. The initials at the bottom did not match any she had seen before, which worried her all the more. Her stomach knotted. Whoever had written that note had not expected the owner of the safe to vanish quietly. It read like an order given to someone with no choice but obedience. George, turning to the bottom shelf, found a rectangular metal box previously hidden behind larger items. It weighed more than it looked. He placed it gently on the blanket beside the other items. Ruth joined him. Together, they unlatched the clasp and lifted the lid. Inside were 3 passports. The same photograph appeared in each, but under different names. The man in the picture appeared middle-aged with thinning hair and a stern expression that tried, and failed, to hide the sense of urgency in his eyes. Each passport showed evidence of travel to places neither Ruth nor George had ever dreamed of visiting, countries known more for turmoil than tourism. Beside the passports lay a small sealed evidence bag containing a tiny recorder, one of those digital devices detectives wore when meeting informants. Another bag held a miniature microphone designed to attach discreetly under a shirt collar. The implications were not simply unsettling, they were dangerous. Ruth felt a cold shiver run through her arms. They had crossed a line the moment they opened this safe. What lay inside was not just forgotten wealth, but active danger, a story that had begun long before they found it and was not finished telling itself. She could feel invisible threads connecting them now to choices made by a man who had either tried to expose corruption or drowned in it himself. Yet, even amidst the fear, something else flickered within her. A strange sense of responsibility. If this man had been trapped or threatened, if he had begun gathering evidence before disappearing, then what they held now was not merely inheritance, it was unfinished truth. They sorted the safe's contents with growing seriousness, dividing items between those that posed immediate risk and those that merely suggested the life of a man who had walked a treacherous path. Every piece added to the picture forming in their minds. This was the stash of a police officer, one who had stepped too close to the edge of corruption, or perhaps too close to revealing it. Hours passed as they meticulously reviewed and organized. The light in the storage unit shifted from afternoon warmth to early evening coolness. Shadows lengthened, stretching across the concrete floor like dark warnings. Ruth suggested they pack up everything for the day. George reluctantly agreed. They placed the folders, binders, money, and evidence bags into storage tubs they brought from home. They wrapped the phone separately, almost afraid of what might happen if it rattled too loudly. They left nothing behind. Even the safe itself remained ajar, a silent witness, but no longer a barrier. As they drove home, the weight of the boxes in the trunk seemed to anchor the car to the road. Neither spoke much. Their hands occasionally brushed between the seats, seeking reassurance without words. Ruth stared at the scenery passing outside her window, houses and trees blurring into muted colors. She wondered about the man whose life had led him to hide so much under steel and lock. Was he afraid when he stopped coming? Did he know time was running short? Was he still alive somewhere, waiting for someone to do something he could no longer do himself? George gripped the steering wheel, scanning every car behind them. It was habit, he told himself, a protective reflex, not fear. And yet, in the back of his mind, he considered the possibility that someone might be watching, waiting for the safe to open. The employee's hesitation earlier replayed in his memory. Something about the way he had spoken, softly, cautiously, eyes drifting toward the far corner of the facility, made George uneasy. The boxes in the trunk were heavy with truth, heavier with implication. They had touched something that people with much more power had worked hard to bury. They had to be wise now, deliberate, careful in ways they had never needed to be before. When they arrived home, Ruth insisted they eat dinner before touching anything else. But the food she placed on the table remained mostly untouched, the weight of the day pressing too hard upon their appetites. After clearing the plates, they spread the contents of the storage tubs across their dining table. Numbers, names, and notes stared back at them. They recognized some of the officers listed, men who had been celebrated in newspapers for drug busts or major arrests. Others had faded into anonymity after short careers. But the numbers beside their names suggested hidden exchanges, quiet agreements, favors bought and sold in shadows. Ruth felt a tug in her chest. Not fear this time, but grief, for all the ordinary people harmed by those who were supposed to protect them, for the witnesses whose testimonies had vanished, for the man who had tried to hold all these secrets long enough to do something meaningful with them. Yet even grief could not blot out the reality before them. They had nowhere to take this information without jeopardizing themselves. If the wrong people discovered the safe's contents were missing from its original location, suspicion would circle back to them immediately. They could not trust the police, not with evidence that implicated their own. They could not remain silent either, not without betraying the truth they had uncovered. The night deepened around them, filling their home with long shadows. Street lights glowed faintly outside the windows, casting soft halos on the walls. Ruth sat with her hands folded, leaning forward slightly, eyes fixed on one particular page. "What do we do now?" she whispered finally, though the question hung in the air like a weight neither of them had the strength to lift yet. George didn't answer right away. He didn't have the answer. Not yet. But he knew one thing. The safe, now sitting open and empty of value, had given them far more than money. It had given them a choice. A dangerous choice, but a powerful one. Whether they were ready or not, the contents of that safe had pulled them into a story still unfolding, one that would push them far beyond the quiet life they once believed was all that remained for them. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The night pressed heavily against the windows of the Adams home, but inside neither Ruth nor George found rest. The piles of documents spread across their dining table seemed to stare back at them with unreadable eyes, each page a silent witness to choices that had already changed the shape of their lives. The small kitchen clock ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt longer than normal, each one stretching with the weight of uncertainty. They tried to sleep eventually, tried to let their minds drift toward simpler thoughts. But fear has a way of slipping under closed doors and settling deep inside the chest where breaths are supposed to come easily. When sleep finally overtook them, it was restless and fragile. Ruth woke first, startled by a noise she didn't recognize. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the nightlight they kept in the hallway. She listened carefully, the drumbeat of her heart loud in her ears. There it was again, a soft vibration. It took her a full 5 seconds to understand the sound. Her eyes snapped toward the kitchen. The phone, the little black phone from the safe, the one that had seemed so dead, so outdated, was ringing. Ruth's breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She reached out and shook George awake, gripping his arm harder than she intended. His eyes opened, immediately alert despite the hours of restless sleep before. He didn't need her to explain. The sound was unmistakable. No one else had that number. It wasn't connected to anything in their lives. It belonged to danger. On the 4th ring, George rose from bed and walked into the kitchen with slow, deliberate steps. The phone continued to vibrate, rattling slightly in the ceramic bowl where they had left it, like something trying to break free. Ruth followed closely, her hands clasped over her chest. At the 5th ring, George allowed instinct to lead him. Before fear could paralyze him, he reached down and answered. He didn't speak first. He simply lifted the phone to his ear and listened. The voice that responded after a moment's silence was low, male, and disturbingly calm. It did not ask who was on the line. It did not identify who was speaking. It simply launched into its message, flat and unyielding. "You should not have opened the safe." Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. George felt his skin tighten with dread. "There are people," the voice continued slowly, "who have gone to great trouble to make sure what's in there stays buried. You have a chance to return everything and walk away. The alternative is something I don't think either of you are prepared for." The tone carried no anger, no emotion at all, just the certainty of someone who expected to be obeyed. The voice paused, as if listening to their breaths, weighing the fear on the other end of the line. "You will receive instructions tomorrow," the voice said. "Do not speak to anyone. Do not share what you found. Put everything back where it was." A second of silence stretched thin. "Or we will." Then the call ended with a soft click. The phone screen went black again, leaving a void that pressed hard against the couple's minds. Ruth grabbed George's arm as he set the device down, her breathing unsteady. She whispered his name, but the sound broke apart halfway through. There was no more sleep after that. They sat together at the table, the documents and cash spread around them like evidence of a crime they had not meant to commit. The silence between them wasn't empty. It churned with questions they couldn't yet bring themselves to ask. When dawn finally crept across their curtains, they looked older than they had the night before. Fear etches lines faster than time ever could. George tried to steady his thoughts by choosing the first clear course of action. They needed to understand exactly what they held. Knowledge might be their only defense. The next step required them to verify the value of the money, carefully, cautiously, and without leaving a trace. They dressed quietly and left the house before neighbors stirred. The drive to the pawn shop felt twice as long as usual, each street corner a place where headlights might suddenly appear behind them. George kept glancing into the rearview mirror. Every car seemed suspicious. Every passing glance felt like surveilling eyes. The pawn shop they chose wasn't the first one that came to mind. They intentionally avoided the shop where they'd been offered too small a sum for the coins, suspecting the man's motives or connections. Instead, they drove to a quieter part of town, to a shop George remembered from years ago, a place run by a soft-spoken proprietor named Everett, who respected the privacy of his clients and still believed in examining valuables with patience rather than hunger. Everett recognized George immediately, his smile warm and genuine. He asked no unnecessary questions when George unfolded the handkerchief containing a selection of gold coins and a vintage watch. He examined them with a magnifying glass, checking for authenticity, condition, and rarity. He handled everything with care, as though reverence was due to objects that had lived through history. His quiet whistle after the third coin was enough to make Ruth's knees weaken. When he slid the watch closer to the light and opened the mechanism, he looked up at George and Ruth in disbelief. "This alone," he said in a voice that suggested both caution and awe, "could set you up very comfortably for the rest of your lives." Then he lowered his glasses and looked into their eyes, reading in them the anxiety that trembled beneath the surface. "You came by these in a complicated way," he said gently. He wasn't accusing them. He was telling them he understood. "Whatever story comes with these pieces, be careful with it." He gave them a fair offer, one so generous that Ruth nearly cried on the spot. But Everett wasn't finished. After sliding the coins and watch back to them, he rested his hands on the counter. "Money this valuable," he said, his voice lowering, "doesn't usually come alone. If there's more to this, think deeply about how you move forward. Some things, some people, don't like anyone interrupting their arrangements." Those words clung to George's mind like burrs long after they returned to the car. They fueled the growing realization that the documents they possessed were worth far more than the money, worth enough that dangerous men would risk everything to recover them. On the drive home, the phone from the safe rang again. This time, neither of them reached for it. They let it vibrate until the sound fell into silence again, though the fear it left behind kept buzzing through their veins long after. Back at the kitchen table, they stared at the ledgers and folders with heavier dread. The threat was now real, alive, and circling. They were custodians of something that could topple careers, take down officers, expose crimes, and destroy the lives of powerful men. Evidence of corruption didn't fade with time. It just grew sharper when dragged into daylight. Ruth slid one hand across the surface of the table until it met George's. Their fingers intertwined, trembling. She looked at him with a type of strength she had built over decades, the strength that had carried them through poverty, humiliation, racist slights, and years of being underestimated. That strength didn't waver now. "We're not thieves," she said softly, shaking her head. "We didn't ask for this, but we have it. And maybe that means we're meant to do something with it." George swallowed, his jaw tightening. The fear in his chest didn't shrink, but he felt something rise alongside it, something stubborn and unyielding. "They tried to scare us quiet," he muttered. "That alone means they're guilty." It wasn't defiance spoken loudly, it was conviction spoken quietly, the type that grows roots before anyone notices. They couldn't go to the local police station. That much was obvious. Some of the very people in these documents likely worked there or had friends there. No, they needed someone outside the reach of these corrupt circles. Someone whose job it was to expose truth, even when it didn't want to be exposed. It was Ruth who remembered a name. A reporter from the city newspaper, known for breaking stories about misconduct in several departments, relentless even when threatened. George had read those articles aloud sometimes, admiring the boldness behind them. They found his contact information online after careful digging. His inbox was public. His office address was listed. His reputation suggested he was familiar with danger. And yet, reaching out felt like stepping into a storm with no umbrella. Before they could decide whether to email or drive to the city, a car slowed outside their home, rolling past at an uncomfortably steady pace. Its windows were too dark to see through. The engine idled low, the hum vibrating in a way that made the house feel suddenly too small, too fragile. The car didn't stop. After a long moment, it continued down the street and disappeared. But the message it delivered without words was undeniable. Someone was watching. Someone knew where to find them. George moved quickly after that, gathering the documents into 2 separate boxes. One would remain hidden here with them. The other, containing the most incriminating evidence, would be taken elsewhere, placed in a safety deposit or handed directly to someone who could ensure its protection. They would not keep everything in one place where danger could swallow it whole in a single strike. The threat had awakened something fierce inside Ruth. "We are not running," she said later that night. "We've run from enough in life, not this." George nodded. Fear was no longer the enemy. Silence was. They sat beside each other until the clock struck midnight again, reviewing the pages, planning the safest way to expose the truth without letting darkness catch them first. Their house was quiet, but no longer peaceful. Their hearts were unsettled, but no longer afraid of being small or unseen. They had been handed a burden. They had been handed a chance. Some people would call it luck. Others would call it a curse. But Ruth and George understood it for what it truly was, a calling. And although the path ahead bent through shadows and danger, they would walk it together step by step, hand in hand, carrying justice for the man whose final hope had been locked away and nearly forgotten inside a silent steel vault. Tomorrow they would make their move. Morning came slowly, as if reluctant to pry open the fragile quiet that had settled over the Adams home in the hours before dawn. Pale light crept cautiously across the carpet, touching the corners of the room where boxes of documents sat neatly stacked, their edges casting long shadows that stretched toward the dining table. Ruth and George had slept only in brief pockets of exhaustion, their sleep punctuated by moments of startled waking, when either imagined the buzz of the black phone or the sound of tires slowing outside their house. Yet morning brought with it a resolve neither had fully expected. Fear still lingered around them like fog, but purpose now cut through it like a thin, steady beam. They ate breakfast because they knew they needed the strength. Ruth moved slower than usual, her hands tremoring slightly as she poured oatmeal into bowls and drizzled honey over the top, though the sweetness went mostly unnoticed by their taste buds. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It felt like the calm before a necessary undertaking, a moment where breath had to gather before the next long exhale. The plan had formed over the course of a restless night. It wasn't perfect, but they didn't need perfect. They needed a safeguard, a way to ensure that the truth they had uncovered would outlive them. They had already decided to contact the investigative reporter once they left home, but before they did that, they needed to protect themselves in another way. Evidence this explosive could not remain in a single location. It had to be divided, duplicated, and placed in hands that knew how to keep secrets until the right moment. George loaded the boxes into the trunk of their aging car, taking care to hide them beneath a blanket and a few old coats. Ruth watched from the kitchen window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Though she trusted her husband completely, she felt a pang of fear seeing him lift those boxes, as though each one carried an invisible weight heavier than any steel safe. Before they left, Ruth wrote down the time and date on a small note card and tucked it into her Bible, an old habit from years when life had taught her never to underestimate the power of documentation. She whispered a brief prayer, not for deliverance, but for clarity and courage. Then she stepped outside and locked the door behind them. The morning sun had risen higher now, sharpening the world into clearer focus. The neighborhood children would soon emerge to board school buses. Neighbors would soon step outside to drink their coffee on porches. Life would continue, unaware of the storm beginning to take shape just behind the Adams trunk lid. As George drove toward the appraisal office where Everett worked, he kept glancing into the rearview mirror. Unlike the night before, the street behind them remained empty, free of suspicious cars or darkened windows, but instinct was a companion no longer silent. It nudged at him, urged caution, reminded him that the men who had threatened them would not disappear simply because dawn had arrived. The drive took them past old brick buildings, small shops opening their metal shutters, and the steady hum of a city waking up. Ruth watched the scenery pass and thought about the man whose face appeared in the 3 passports they found in the safe. She wondered what he had feared most when he gathered all that evidence. She wondered whether he had been alone when he made the decision to hide the truth rather than let it die. In that moment, she felt a strange kinship with him. He had been trapped between doing what was safe and doing what was right, just as they were now. They reached Everett's shop just after its doors opened. The bell above the door chimed gently when they stepped inside, releasing a soft scent of old leather and polished wood. The shop felt like a sanctuary of sorts, a place where objects carried stories but not secrets. Everett looked up from behind the counter, surprise flickering briefly across his features before he smiled warmly. "You two again?" he said as they approached. "I was just thinking about those coins." But his smile faded slightly when he caught the tension in their faces. He led them to the back room where conversations held more privacy. Ruth and George sat opposite him, and for the first time since meeting him, they allowed some of the truth to slip through. Never the full picture, but enough for him to understand this was more than a simple sale. Everett listened quietly, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening as he absorbed their words. When George finally explained that they needed the coins appraised officially through a trusted network, Everett nodded slowly. "I can do that," he said. "But if there's danger attached to where these came from, you need to be careful. Very careful." His tone was firm, not fearful. He was not a man accustomed to panic, but he recognized when a situation called for caution. He stepped away to make a call to an auction firm he trusted, a place known for its discretion as much as for its accuracy in evaluation. Ruth and George waited in silence, listening to the murmur of Everett's low voice behind the closed door. When he returned, he handed George a small envelope with a number written on it. "Take them here," he said. "You'll be treated fairly." But then he did something unexpected. He closed the lid of the ledger they had not shown him directly, yet he seemed to sense its weight. He placed a gentle hand on it and looked George in the eyes. "Whatever you do with the rest of this," he said in a soft, earnest voice, "think about the man who hid it. Think about his reasons, and think about who might want it back." They left his shop with gratitude and apprehension mingling in equal measure. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was a step toward protection. Their next stop was the sheriff's substation on the edge of town. Not to march inside and hand over the files, that would have been foolish and dangerous, but to evaluate how closely it was being monitored, and whether any of the names in the documents aligned with those carved near the entrance of the building. They parked across the street and watched. Officers came and went, some wearing expressions of indifference, others looking exhausted even at the start of their shift. George checked the list of names in the ledger. 4 of them matched badges they had seen on the news over the years. Officers praised for specific operations or task force assignments. 2 of them now worked inside that very building. A cold ripple passed through Ruth. She realized that if they had stepped inside with the evidence earlier that morning, those men might have taken the documents or worse, silenced the couple entirely. They drove away quickly, neither needing to say what they already understood. Their next call had to be made from somewhere safer, somewhere far from familiar faces. They drove to a neighboring town 20 minutes away, stopping at a public library where people drifted in and out quietly, unnoticed by anyone except the librarian arranging books with meticulous care. They chose a computer near the back, out of sight, and logged into a temporary email account Ruth created on the spot. The message they composed to the journalist was simple, careful, and deliberate. They offered no names, no addresses, only a reference to evidence about police corruption that had been hidden for years, and a request to meet in a crowded public location. They included one image, a blurred photograph of a single ledger page, enough to prove seriousness, but not enough to betray everything. Then they hit send and waited. Minutes later, the journalist replied. He asked for a time, a place, and a signal phrase to ensure he wasn't walking into a trap himself. His tone was professional but unmistakably urgent. He had chased danger before, and he recognized its scent now. Ruth and George agreed to meet him the following morning in a busy cafe near the center of town. They chose a table along the window where they could see everyone entering. They chose a phrase that would be impossible to mistake. The safe was never empty. As they left the library, they both felt the faint shift of something dangerous clearing its throat, as if the world was preparing to move around them rather than simply pass by. Back home, the phone from the safe lay in its bowl, silent at last. George powered it on briefly, just long enough to check if any new messages had been recorded. But the phone displayed no recent calls, no voicemail, no trace of the conversation they had heard. It was as though the call had passed through the device like a ghost, leaving no footprints. The absence of evidence was more unsettling than the call itself. Ruth wrapped the phone in a towel and placed it inside a tin box, then set it deep inside a cupboard they rarely opened. She didn't want to touch it, but neither could she bring herself to destroy it. Something told them both it wasn't finished. Not yet. That night, they spoke quietly about what would happen if their plan worked. Not in grand dreams, but in practical hopes. Paying off the house, helping their grandchildren through school, putting food in the pantry without calculating the cost twice. They talked not of reward, but of relief. Relief from the fear that had shadowed their lives for years. Relief from the daily balance and act of poverty. Relief from the knowledge that danger now lurked behind them. George squeezed Ruth's hand gently, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted but steady. Before going to bed, they spread the remaining documents and organized them once more. They removed a handful of the most critical files, the ones that named specific officers, specific dates, specific transactions, and placed them in a fireproof lockbox they had bought long ago but never used. George carried the lockbox into their bedroom and slid it beneath the bed where only they would know it lay. When they finally turned off the lights, the house felt different. Not safer, but less vulnerable. They had taken the first step away from fear and toward something that felt like justice. Tomorrow would bring risk. Tomorrow might bring confrontation. Tomorrow was the moment the truth would begin its journey beyond the confines of their dining table. But tonight, for the first time in days, the walls of their home felt steady, and the tremble in their chests eased enough for sleep to come gently. Before her eyes closed fully, Ruth whispered into the darkness, "We're doing the right thing." And for the first time since the black phone rang, George believed it. Morning arrived not with peace, but with a current of unease that threaded through the air like static. Ruth woke first, as she often did, her mind already alert before her eyes fully opened. For a moment, she lay still, listening. The house was quiet in that particular way that made the heart strain for hidden sounds. When none came, she exhaled shakily and sat up, her hand resting briefly on the fireproof lockbox beneath the bed. Its presence grounded her. It reminded her that their fear was not directionless anymore. It had purpose. George stirred beside her, blinking against the early light filtering through the curtains. He looked older this morning, the wear of the past days written in clearer lines on his face. Still, when Ruth reached for his hand, he squeezed back with the same steady reassurance he had given her over decades of challenges. They rose together, each movement dictated by the heavy thought of what lay ahead. They moved through their morning routine as though afraid that breaking the familiar rhythm would tempt fate. Coffee brewed, though neither sipped much of it. Toast browned, then went untouched. George locked the doors twice before they stepped out to the car, the boxes now placed in separate hidden spots in the trunk. One ready to be delivered to the reporter, the other staying with them until they knew what the world would do with this story. The cafe where they were to meet the journalist sat in the heart of a busy downtown area, a place where anonymity hid within crowds and background noise swallowed secrets. They arrived early, deliberately, choosing a table near the window as planned. Sunlight reflected off passing cars, momentarily blinding them as traffic ebbed and flowed. People rushed by outside, each engaged in their own life, unaware of the quiet storm forming at that second-floor table. George kept his gaze scanning the room. He watched every entrance, every person who lingered too long near the counter without ordering. Ruth held a trembling hand around her coffee, the warmth grounding her even as she barely lifted the mug to her lips. Minutes stretched long, too long. Then a man walked in, mid-40s, neatly dressed, eyes sharp but tired. He paused at the entrance just a fraction too long, surveying the room with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to searching for danger. His gaze eventually found them. George nodded once. The man approached, sat opposite them, and whispered the agreed phrase, barely louder than a breath. The safe was never empty. Relief mixed with anxiety. It was time. He placed a leather satchel on the floor beside his chair and leaned forward. "My name is Daniel Harris," he said softly, "and I want you to know that whatever you found, you're not alone anymore." Ruth's breath wavered, but she held still. George slid one of the boxes forward, lifting the lid just enough for Daniel to glimpse the top document, one that named a high-ranking officer associated with a series of unsolved deaths. Daniel's eyes widened, but he quickly masked his reaction. "This," he whispered, "is bigger than anything I've worked on before." He asked careful questions: how they found the safe, who had contacted them, what threats they had received. Ruth and George answered with precise honesty, avoiding speculation but revealing the fear that had crept into their lives. Daniel listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every detail. "This man who called you," Daniel said, "was cautious enough to leave no trace. That means he is connected, deeply connected." George nodded grimly. "Which is why we came to you." Daniel sat back, absorbing the weight of trust given to him. "I have a secure contact with the state attorney's office, not the local division, higher up, outside the influence of anyone in these documents. But to move forward, I need everything, and I need time." "Time," Ruth echoed, "is the one thing we're afraid we don't have." Daniel placed a business card face down on the table. "If they confront you again, call me, day or night. If I don't answer, leave the line open." He closed the box, latched it securely, and slid it into his satchel. "You did the right thing," he assured them. The words should have comforted them. They didn't. If anything, they confirmed the magnitude of what they had done. They parted ways quietly. Daniel walked toward the street, disappearing into the bustle. Ruth and George remained in their seats a little longer, waiting until the nervous pulse in their bodies slowed. When they finally stood to leave, neither noticed the man who remained seated at the far end of the cafe, newspaper raised, though his eyes were not reading. They followed every move the couple made. The first sign of pursuit came halfway home. A black SUV trailing several cars behind, always in sight but never close enough to be obvious. George noticed it first, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. "Don't turn directly home," Ruth whispered. He didn't. He took unfamiliar streets, looping through neighborhoods they rarely visited. The SUV stayed behind, always 3 or 4 vehicles back, always just present enough to be noticed. Finally, George turned into a crowded shopping center and parked near the entrance. They sat silently, pretending to check grocery lists while their hearts pounded painfully in their chests. When the SUV finally drove past, continuing down the main road without stopping, neither dared speak for a long time. Back home, curtains were drawn tighter, lights kept low. The phone from the safe remained sealed in the tin box. The silence in their home was no longer peaceful. It was alert, listening. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. Ruth froze. George stepped to the peephole with cautious movements. A delivery driver stood outside holding a padded envelope. George opened the door only a crack. "Package for Walters," the driver said. George's heart skipped unpleasantly. They never used their first name with deliveries. He debated refusing, but something in the man's expression said he was merely a messenger. George signed with a false scribble, took the envelope, and locked the door immediately. Inside, they stared at the object like it was a venomous creature. Ruth urged him to open it carefully. Inside lay a single sheet of paper. Nothing typed. Only one handwritten sentence. "Return what is not yours." Ruth's breath shook, but she didn't allow fear to swallow her completely. "They know," she whispered. "They know where we live. They know what we have." George folded the paper calmly, though his fingers trembled. "And now they know we won't scare easy." Night descended again, with a heaviness that bore down on them like a threat. They kept lamps off, moving quietly from room to room as though sound itself had become dangerous. Ruth held the lockbox in her lap, unwilling to leave it out of sight. George sat close beside her, hand resting atop hers. "We did the right thing," she said, repeating the belief that had become their anchor. George nodded. whatever comes next, we face it together. In that quiet moment, the buzzing phone startled them both. Not the black phone, George's own. Daniel's name flashed across the screen. George answered immediately. "I got the files," Daniel said, his voice urgent. "You were right to keep some. There's something happening. Papers missing from my desk after I stepped away. A car parked outside the office. Whatever this is, these people are already pushing back. But you're safe for now. Stay alert and wait for my call. And whatever you do, keep the rest hidden." The line clicked dead. George set the phone down slowly. They sat in the silence that followed, knowing without question now that they were in the center of a battle between truth and secrecy, a battle that had already claimed at least one life. But fear did not own them anymore. They had become custodians of something vital, something powerful. A few weeks later, when the investigation broke open on the evening news, the Adams home filled with a strange, overwhelming quiet. Their television screen showed Daniel Harris standing at a podium, files in hand, announcing widespread corruption charges against officials throughout the county. He mentioned evidence recovered from a secure location, investigations reopened into suspicious deaths, millions of seized funds finally accounted for. Justice had begun to move, and though their names were never mentioned, Ruth and George knew. They had sparked the flame. Soon after, a letter arrived from an attorney representing the family of the disappeared officer whose belongings they had uncovered. No threats this time, only gratitude. A substantial portion of money from the seized assets, legally redistributed, had been anonymously directed toward the Adamses through a charitable fund. Enough to fix the house, enough to help their grandchildren, enough to let them live without counting each penny. With trembling hands, Ruth placed the letter on the table and cried, not because they were saved, but because the man who hid those secrets, who died alone with his fear, had finally been heard. The phone from the safe never rang again. One evening, George powered it up once more. No call log, no record. It showed nothing but a blank screen, as though its purpose had vanished with the danger. They threw it away. Months later, Ruth and George walked along the ocean for the first time in their lives. Seagulls wheeled in the sky. Waves rolled in with the slow power of something eternal. They held hands, shoes off, letting the cold water wash over their tired feet. They breathed in salt air and laughed, surprised by how young that laughter made them feel. Ruth leaned her head on George's shoulder. "Can you believe all this began with a dusty storage unit?" George smiled softly, watching the horizon glow. "No," he replied. "It began the moment we chose hope over fear." As they stood together against the wind, the world wide open before them, they finally understood the true reward of their journey. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the justice. It was the knowledge that courage does not fade with age, that new beginnings don't expire, that ordinary people can carry extraordinary truth if they choose to stand instead of flee. Their best days had not been behind them after all. Sometimes the universe hides second chances where no one thinks to look, behind steel doors, beneath dust and fear, waiting for the moment when two ordinary souls are brave enough to turn the dial and open the vault. Peace, they realized, belongs to the honest, and they had been both honest and bold. Together, they stepped forward into the future that had once seemed impossible, knowing now that life can change as quickly as a lock clicking open in the dark. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next videos. Check out our other videos for more incredible discoveries and untold secrets that will leave you amazed. Share this video with your friends and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from?